Good morning, everyone. This is Jimmie Prow here in the Engineering CAD Systems office. Today we're going to be talking about polishing your prints. We'll discuss how to customize print drivers and pin tables to get the desired results when you're printing. So the topics we're going to be covering today are the power of a pin table. We'll look at how to grayscale references. That's always frequent questions we get. We'll look at a few different ways to get multiple shades of gray, and we'll talk about transparencies without rasterized option. So we'll begin by talking about the power of a pin table. Pin tables are a very effective method of customizing your output. They're really powerful, and you could change entire files right down to a single element in a file. And when I say you change it, you can turn things off, you can change the symbology, you can change like the weight, or if you're doing color printing, you can change the color or the style, change the order, make some things come up in front of others or behind others. So you can do a lot of things with the pin table right at print time without necessarily having to do things in the design file. Other good thing about pin tables is they're easy to work with. Editing a pin table, there's really only 3 steps you got to do. You got to insert a section, you got to define the selection criteria, and you define the output actions. It's kind of like making a selection set and then changing all of the symbology when you're working in MicroStation, only in this case you're doing it only at print time. So, like I said, the first step is to insert a section. And a section is really just a container of selection type data and output data. So the section, you'll see here on the screen how it's created. You'll edit the pin table, and on the Modify Pin Table dialog, you can select the Edit option and then insert new section below or above, and just insert a section in the list there. And then this section will hold the selection criteria and output actions for whatever action you're doing to adjust the output. And then you can use the options here, the up and the down, to adjust the order of those as needed. So you might want to do things like change all of the elements in one file to a light gray, and then select just one of the elements in there and change it to a dash line or something. So you'd want to change them all gray first and then do the dash or something like that. So you could change the order of when these changes would take effect in the print. Step 2 is to define the selection criteria. And like I said before, it's like a selection set. You can, have a MicroStation use the power selector to select things by level or style or whatever. Well, in this case, you would define the element selection criteria, and you can do that based on what files it's in. For example, if you're trying to grayscale references, the weight of elements, the color of elements, the fill color, level. And you can use regular expressions to identify a level too. So if it's a common level, like you want to do all your text, you could say text.star and affect all of your text. And basically what you want to do is define enough properties so that you can uniquely identify the element. So if you can identify it just on level, then all you got to do is define level. But if you're going to have to do level and then weight or level and color to uniquely identify an element, then you would have to define both of those. And that's the basic rule for defining element selection criteria, is you want to just define enough information to uniquely identify it. And all the properties aren't required, so you could leave a lot of that blank. And then the final step, step 3, is to define the output action. So now that you've defined the element selection criteria, you want to define what action you want to take on all those elements that get selected. And basically what you would do here is just select a checkbox by whichever property you want to modify, and then set the new attributes for that property. So you might want to change the fill to off, or the color to 20 to grayscale it, or something like that. So that's the way that would work. You'd define your selection criteria and then define the output for that selection. And then there's one more thing when you're working with pin tables you want to keep in mind is there's some options that you can define. And one that's very important is the ability to match multiple element selections. And by default it's off. So if you just create a new pin table, it's going to be turned off. You'll want to go in and go to pin table options and select match multiple element selections. If you don't, and you do like I said earlier, and you say you select everything in a reference file and turn it gray, and then later on you add another criteria to change a weight, well, it'll ignore the second one. It's going to find the first one and then do that action and then stop unless you have this checkbox selected. So that's why I wanted to point that out. So let's go ahead and take a look at what we just talked about there. We'll work on building a pin table from scratch, and one good example of that is with the new color filled key maps. You know, we've had a lot of issues with those coming in, you know, with a solid black square, or if you print them in color like this. There's just a lot of different levels, a lot of different element types we can work with. So this is a good example of how we can use pin tables. My reference to see you know, the different shields and the bridges and the square. We're using this just to test the pin table here. So to begin with, I'm just going to go to the print dialog. And as we talked about, by default, it's just going to come in as a black. If I can get to the background. Those are just, it's all filled shapes in the background. And since our plot drivers really only have two colors, black and gray, it just comes out as a solid black square. And I'll show you what I'm talking about. If we go to Edit Printer Driver Configuration, and I said our plot drivers only have two colors. If we go to the Color Maps tab, you'll see everything is 0, 0, 0. So everything is black except color 20. And then that's what we use to grayscale things, and it's set to 150. So that's why everything is set to black here. Now what I've done in some of the more recent pin tables, if I attach the FDOT, the default FDOT pin table, you'll see it turns that off. Now that's, I forget which maintenance release that came out in, but I tweaked it so it'll turn all the fill off in a reference. So that will be a good point to start with. So let's take a look at that pin table. If I now that we've attached that pin table, I've gone pin table attach. We pick that FDOT TBL, and then we want to say pin table edit, and I'll show you how the fill is turned off there. So basically, remember we was talking about we needed a section. In this case, that's the key map section that I created. And then I'm selecting, to define the element selection criteria, I told it find all of the cells, all the shapes, strings, just all these different element types in a file with a logical name comap.star, and then do the output action to turn the fill off and set the color to 0. So it kind of overrides all of those colors in the maps and sets them all to 0, which prints black. So that's why you're seeing what we see here. So this doesn't really answer all the questions, particularly in this map. You'll see in this map, do a preview. So now you can see this a little bit better now that we're in close. You see that the fill's turned off, but like the road lines still go through the shields, and the bridges and stuff aren't filled in. So what we'll do is we'll go through and tweak this a little bit more. So let's begin by just they show up in front of the roads like it does here in the map. So what we want to do is step 1 was to create a new section, right? So we want to insert a new section below, and we'll just do county road shields, and we'll start with the county road shields. Another thing with the county road shields is they're real heavy because they're double lined. So while we're tweaking the fill in the background of those, we'll also try to adjust the weight a little bit. So for the county road shields, first we want to define the element selection criteria, right? Or step 1 is to create the section. Step 2 is to define the element selection criteria. And to do that, we want to identify what level it's on. So it's on road shields, county road. So we can define that by level here. And if we went through and find road shields, county roads, okay, and so that's what we've got defined there. Again, you define as much or as little information as you need. In here, that should uniquely identify this, so we can finish there and go to step 3, which is to define the output action. And for the output action, we want to change the fill for those. You know, earlier we changed the fill off for everything in the reference. Now, just for the county map shields, we want to turn the field on. And let's go ahead and change that weight while we're at it. Width, we'll set the width to 0 to try to lighten up those double lines some. And let's save that and see what we have. So when I save my pin table, now I need to go in, and you'll see, okay, so now it's filled, but they filled as black because it was 0, right? And 0 is going to be black here. So now what we want to do is adjust that color of the fill. So we'll select fill color, and instead of doing by index and saying 0 and using our pin number 0, 1, 2, 3, whatever, I'm going to use RGB value. And I want to change this to, say, a pure white. And go 250 or 255. 255 to, oops, 255. And OK. And then save this. And if we go back to the preview, now you see that since it's not using a pin, we're defining the actual RGB value of that color. It fills in that shape with the background and covers the road lines going behind it. So that took care of the county roads, but you also see there's some other things in there. So we would basically just repeat those steps. We'd create another section for the US root markers. And again, you got to uniquely identify those. So we'll come over here. First, we'll create a new section. And we'll just create a new section below. And US markers. We'll give it a logical name so we can tell what we're working with. And we'll select that one. Then we're going to define the element selection criteria. In this case, you see it's on level default. So we'll want to find level default, and we'll define the output action for that. And again, we want to do the fill, and we want to set the fill color. We want to set fill on, and we want to set the fill color to RGB value. And we'll just do 255. 255. 255. And then save that. So if we can do another preview there. So now you see, so basically you just go through and tweak these to make those adjustments. Another area would be the bridges, and I don't know if I don't see one in this area, but it's basically the same logic over and over again. Again, we'd just select the bridge type and adjust the fill for that. So we've got a question here. It says, how is the list processed? If the element meets the first item in the list, do any of the others process? Okay, so let's just look at this. So we've got this list of selection criteria, and by default we had a few in the default FDOT pin table. So this goes back to the pin table options. Now I've told it here to match multiple selection element selections. If I did not have that checked, it would go through here. It would go through all of these items, but if a single element, let's say this element met this condition and this condition, it would make the modifications it found in this condition and then stop. It would never modify it for this condition. That's why you've got to go to the pin table options and turn this on and tell it to match multiple element selections. So if it does match this condition and this condition, it'll make this change first, which is to turn the fill off, and then it'll match this condition and say, okay, well, just for this unique level, turn the fill back on and change the color of that fill. So yes, it can match multiple selections, but you've got to tell it in the options to do that. Okay, any other questions on that? Okay then. So we'll go back to the PowerPoint. So that's pin tables, and you can see how easy they are. Again, just 3 basic steps: create your section, define the selection criteria, and define the output criteria. So next we're going to talk about grayscaling references. And this is always something people ask about. To grayscale references, you can define the element selection criteria based on the logical name of the reference. Now you could do it, technically you could do it by the slot number as well, but you know, when you're clipping sheets, they aren't always going to be in the same order. If you use the reference logical names, then, and you always use the same logical names for your references, then you can reuse the pin table on multiple projects then, you know, or multiple sheets within the project where the logical or the slot numbers for the references might not work. So it's a much more flexible way of doing it. And it uses what MicroStation calls regular expressions. And regular expressions are basically a way you can use wildcards to define the reference name. And we'll go through a couple more slides, and then we'll jump back into MicroStation, and I'll show you all of that information as well. So we talked about grayscaling references. What if you want to do multiple shades of gray? We'll look at a few different ways to do multiple shades of gray. And it can be accomplished by adding pins to your PLT CFG file. It can be done by using RGB values in your pin table. And it can be done by using screening percentages in your pin table. And we'll look at each of those and how easily they can be adjusted. And then finally, we want to talk about transparencies without rasterized. And this can be accomplished to look like it's using transparencies, but it really doesn't. It's using more shading and filled shapes and just adjusting the order of those shapes. And you know, why would you want to do that? You know, if you're using transparencies in MicroStation, well, it's going to increase the speed of your printing if you don't use the rasterized option. It's going to reduce the size of your prints, and it's going to allow you to have searchable text in your PDF files. And we'll take a closer look at that too. It looks like we're going to have time. So let's go ahead and jump into MicroStation and look at a few of those things. So if I go into MicroStation, excuse me, I'm fighting a little bit of a cold here. Let's go into MicroStation and let me change files here. I've got a file with some shading on it. And we'll look at a couple different ways to do this. So I've got a file here. You see I've got shading. If I place a fence around this, I'm just going to close this pin table down for a minute. Let's go ahead and place a fence around that and go get a preview. So again, we've got shading in there. We've got some filled space to identify widening and such. And our plot driver's only got two colors, right? Black and 150, which is a gray. And since that's not color 20, you can see that's blue. It's going to come in as a black shape. So what can we do about that? Well, one thing is that's transparency. So if I look at my view attributes, I've got transparency turned on. If I turn it off, you can see how dark it is. So I've got transparency turned on. I could just go to rasterized option here. And if we go to preview, you can see it shows my shading. And you know, that's acceptable. You see your light shading for this area. You got a different kind here where you're just going to remove some existing pavement and construct widening. That's a darker gray with the lines going a different direction. So that's what I'm talking about, multiple shades of gray, how you can, you know, affect something like this. So we're looking at one method here with rasterized option. So let's talk about why you wouldn't want to do that. Well, one thing is if I print this now, and let's see, I'm just going to go ahead and create a PDF. So if I print this, and we'll just call this raster 1, and create this. You see how long it's taken to print just this one simple sheet? It's not complicated. It's breaking it up in a bunch of tiles. What rasterized means, it doesn't mean that you've got rasters attached or anything. It's going to rasterize this and make pictures of that file. And so all you're really getting is a printed picture. If we go now to let's go to our current working directory and open on the other screen, and we'll go to ENG data. So we got this PDF here. And if we look in the PDF, oops, wrong thing I drug over there. If we look in the PDF, it looks fine. It looks like we saw in our preview. We've got the shaded here with the lines and the shaded. But the size of that PDF is going to be larger than it would be otherwise because it's a bunch of images. Another thing, if we go to try to find something, like let's just search for project. If I search for that, it's going to see it found no matches. So if we do the same thing without Rasterized checked on, and we'll just say no raster, and see it finished that. You see how quick that was? It didn't even pop the dialog up. If you wasn't paying attention, you missed it. So if we look at no raster, let's widen this out. One thing is this is a simple sheet, and you can see so there's not a whole lot of size difference. If this was a PostScript file, it would be like 3 megs to 30 megs. These simple PDFs you don't see quite the size difference, but you can see it is smaller. And let's say if I double click on this one, you see it still looks basically the same, which is funny. It really shouldn't. If we do Control F to find something here, oops, I did Control P to print. Control F and then look for project. You see it's going to bounce around and find all of the word project on the sheet. So that's one thing it gives you, is the ability to have searchable text by not doing that. The other thing, we've seen the size difference, and we also seen the difference in speed and printing. So if you had a bunch of sheets and you were using Rasterized, it would just take a lot longer to print those. Okay, so that's the difference between Rasterized and not Rasterized. So what we want to look at next is we had a question here: can you mimic displaying transparencies by creating a pin table? And that's what we're going to look at now. I'm going to, instead of using Rasterized for these, I'm going to look at a few different ways to, if we look at the preview here, you see how they're all shaded now. We're going to look at a couple different ways we can tweak this pin table. And actually, let's just create a new one. So let's go back to the original and open up the oops, wrong button. Pin table attach. I got several here. Pin table edit. So I've already added that stuff. And we can go ahead and use this one. I'm just going to add a new section below here. And normally you might use different pin tables for this, but in this case it's going to work fine because we're not going to have the same levels we're affecting for our key sheets in our plan sheets. So in this case we can go ahead and say let's do one for light gray and one for dark gray. So we'll just say LT gray. And so the light gray, we've got, what level is this on? This is on a miscellaneous 0. So we've defined the section. We want to define the selection criteria. We'll say, okay, level miscellaneous 0. Oops, too far. We'll say miscellaneous 0. And on the element output action, we'll just say we want to set the color to an RGB scale, and we'll just pick I don't know, 100, 100, 100. So that's kind of dark. Let's do 200, 200, and 200. So that's a lighter gray. And we'll say OK there. So this is one method using RGB. We've got a light gray, and then we can create another section for dark gray. Insert new section below. And we'll say and in this case we want to select this shape, which is miscellaneous 2. So we'll say miscellaneous 2. Okay, and in this case we want it dark, so we'll use the we want to change the fill color to RGB, and we want it to be the 200. Actually, I did that backwards, didn't I? I always get those backwards. Okay, so that's the darker gray. So we want to change the fill color. We'll turn to that. And in this one, I actually changed the color. I want to change the fill color.